see if we can continue our reflections here about what it means to lead as a governing board. He says there's little point for the board to describe its expectations carefully if it is then unclear about who is accountable for the expectations, that the expectations are met. The board may delegate to committees and to individual board members, but its most common delegation inside the board itself is to the chief governance officer. The most common delegation outside the board is to the CEO. That is, to help ensure the board's accountability is fulfilled, the board shares parts of the job of governance itself with committees and officers and gives the entire job of running the organization to the CEO. These delegated parts should never be allowed to overlap. I just stop here for a moment. That's one of the controversial elements in the Carver model. Should they overlap? Some would argue they should, others argue they shouldn't. Carver is one who says they should not overlap. I tend to kind of lean more toward Carver on this because the overlap, when it occurs, tends to blur responsibilities in my view, and you end up with organizational confusion and a sort of diminishing of the CEO's role and respect because he's compromised by this confusion of who's in charge. In any case, to continue, to do so reduces the certainty of achievement, leaving the board's own accountability at risk. A precept expressed by the old management maxim, if two persons are responsible, no one is. Having shared out parts of its overall accountability, the board is still accountable for the total. As shown on the right side of figure 3, that circle of responsibility, all authority for interpreting ends and executive limitations policies is given to the CEO, along with accountability for their achievement. It's important that the CEO's authority over the operational organization be total. Otherwise, the various divisions of effort that occur in management might not add up to success. Similarly, as shown on the left side of the figure, all authority for interpreting governance process and board management delegation policies is given to the chief governance officer, along with accountability for their achievement. A board can delegate portions of the left side to a committee, to committees if it chooses, but the CGO remains the default setting. We recommend maintaining as much simplicity as possible, so that in this guide we will only address the CEO and CGO as non-overlapping delegatees. We will talk about committees too, but only to point out practices to avoid. The CEO. When a board chooses to use a CEO function to connect the board to management, it has in effect decided that the job of making the organization work is delegated to the CEO and to the CEO alone. Otherwise, he's not really a chief executive officer, he's a chief intermediate officer or something. Ends and executive limitations policies are directions to the CEO and only the CEO, and describe the board's expectations for organizational performance. If the board delegates the same job or parts of it to more than one person or group, it is unintentionally asking for the development of turf battles and enabling everyone except the board itself to evade accountability. The CEO function is useful precisely because it enables the board to focus its expectations on the organization as a whole rather than on various divisions of labor within the organization. With policy governance, internal divisions, the organizational chart of departments, offices, or other components, are means choices of the CEO. But the great utility for boards in having a CEO will exist only if the CEO function is correctly used. In another figure, we see a very simple organizational chart or chain of command. The board works for the owners, so when it makes policies, particularly ends policies, it does so on owners' behalf. In the diagram, there is a single arrow from the board to the CEO. This arrow represents the board's single voice, a voice that describes the organization's job, expressed in ends and executive limitations policies. If there were more than one line to the CEO, to whose voice should the CEO listen and report? The board's? The loudest or most expert individual? The CEO's favorites? If the CEO is to comply with board expectations, then surely it only introduces confusion as well as a place to hide if the board allows others to instruct as well. Here's the diagram of the board and the CEO that was mentioned, I think, earlier. Ownership, board, CEO, and then the staff underneath the CEO. Sorry, it's sideways, but that's the way it is. The chain of command from ownership to CEO. The Policy Governance Board ensures that nothing in its structural arrangements interferes with its delegation to the CEO or comes between it and the CEO. Much of the power in proper delegation is its simplicity, a virtue easily sacrificed by clutter. Maintaining simplicity enables delegation to be both powerful and safe. If you think that the policy governance model gives a great deal of authority to the CEO, you are right. The CEO position is the board's device to ensure that the board's accountability to owners for an organization that works is fulfilled. To have a CEO and not empower him or her to the maximum is self-defeating. The policy governance model can be used by a board that does not have a CEO. Governing without a CEO is more complex due to there being no focal point of empowerment and accountability. Consequently, since the use of the policy governance must take these extra difficulties into account, we will not deal with them in these guides. The CGO. The Chief Governance Officer, as depicted in Figure 3, is neither superior nor subordinate to the CEO. CGO and CEO are parallel offices, each empowered by and accountable to the board directly. Just as the board uses Robert Greenleaf's term, is a servant leader for the ownership, the CGO is a servant leader for the board. That is, the CGO is not the board's boss, but does have board-granted authority to interpret and enforce the rules the board has set for itself. The board, in which all organizational authority resides at the outset, is composed of equals, none of whom has any authority as individuals. Okay? According to the board, this policy governance model now, the board is composed of equals, none of whom has any authority as individuals. You take away a person from the board, nothing changes. One person within the board has no authority. They only have authority as board as a whole, members of it, and when the board speaks, it speaks as a whole. So the board decides to take a defined amount of its group authority and give it to its first among equals in order to ensure the group discipline is to which it is committed. In other words, the CGO has only the authority the board decides. He or she is expected to perform so that a reasonable interpretation of the board's governance process and board management delegation policies is accomplished by the board. The CGO's authority and responsibility can be changed by the board at any time. They are not for the CGO to decide. Servant leadership of this sort is a sensitive balance to maintain, so deserves continual explicit attention by the board. The CGO role is usually fulfilled by the person most boards call chair and some call president, but it is possible that a given CGO will discharge his or her obligation for board consistent meeting conduct by appointing a chair to carry out that part of the CGO's accountability. As with all delegation, the CGO remains accountable even if he or she has further delegated parts of the job. We give more attention to the CEO and CGO roles in the Carver Policy Guide on leadership roles. Sources of confused accountability. In order to keep the board to CEO part of the chain of command diagram intact, the board must take steps of some common structural problem. There are a number of ways in which the board endangers their one voice and let the CEO off the hook of accountability. Here are some, and I'll just run through these quickly. The renegade board member, where they contradict or add instructions given by the CEO, by the board to the CEO. Okay. The CEGO or chair is an important officer in the policy governance system, but he or she does not hold executive authority. We have often seen bylaws that describe the chair as the board member who has responsibility for running the organization, for supervision of running it, for being the communication link between the board and the CEO. We've seen board chairs decide on their own to give instructions to the organization, usually because the board has not done so itself. Such roles for a board chair damage accountability. Policy governance boards eliminate word from their bylaws that gives the chair the right to be, as it were, the Uber CEO, since the chair with such authority diminishes the accountability of the intended CEO. It does so by risking turf battles over authority and by obscuring who is accountable for performance. The treasurer finance chair. It's easy to understand in a small organization, without staff, or one with staff but no CEO, asking a financially skilled board member to look after the books and make a good deal of sense. However, when the organization has a CEO, it is this officer and not the treasurer who must be held accountable for financial management. The bylaws that describe the treasurer as accountable to the board that finances are handled prudently should be changed. A CEO not empowered to make and be held accountable for financial decisions is really not a CEO at all. If your organization is required by law or regulation to have a treasurer who is a board member, the job should be described in a way that enhances the board's ability to govern rather than interferes with the delegation of the CEO. Board committees in general. Committee-like forms are often known by other names such as task force and others, but no matter what term is used, the same rules apply. Therefore, policy governance rules for committees apply to any group that is created by the board or is given its job by the board, no matter who is in it or what it is called. When committees are created to help the board carry out its own hands-on job, they can be very useful, but many board committees are created in order to instruct, help, or advise staff. If the CEO is to be held accountable by the board for meeting its expectations, those expectations or instructions should come only from the board, not from the committee. Other involvement can honestly be called help or advice only if the input provided was invited by the CEO and it could be ignored by him or her. Input that cannot be ignored is instruction. You are well aware that staff members normally do not feel free to ignore the input of board committees, even when the committees genuinely intend only to be advisory. Committees of the board necessarily interrupt the chain of command when given jobs to do in the staff domain. This is why policy governance boards observe the rule that they will create committees to help with governance, but will not create them to help with management. And this is really key and just such a common challenge. The executive committee. Executive committees are often created by bylaws to ensure that someone has authority in case something comes up between board meetings. Of course, between board meetings is when things do come up, and to have no delegatees clearly empowered to make decisions makes no sense. Policy governance boards give their CEO and CGO sufficient authority over their domains, making an executive committee rarely necessary. Often an executive committee with the authority to make decisions when the board is not in session may actually be the board, maybe the board more than the board is the board. That is a huge power giveaway, especially suspect since the authority is almost never accompanied by performance expectations. In addition, executive committees are smaller and more agile than the entire board and can process a large number of decisions into which the board has little or no input. Board members, not the executive committee, therefore, tend to see this committee as more equal than the rest, hardly a recipe for board wholeness. What can become of a board within the board is to be avoided. Okay, I'm going to stop there on this so it doesn't get too long in this section, and do want to come back on this because I have some personal examples to give here. So let's now discuss this, and feel free to chat, write a chat note on any questions you have.